Well, welcome to everyone who's joined this session, and thank you so much for prioritising it. It's great to have you all here. We'll have people, I'm sure, joining as I'm talking, but that's I'm sure we'll get used to the beeping noises they do. Just to introduce myself, I'm John Yates. I'm the Youth Endowment Fund's CEO, and as you may know, the YEF exists to find out what works to prevent violence, and then to make sure that gets put into practice. There's no point working out what needs to be done if it doesn't get done. Just a couple of things from me to start us off. The first is thank you to everyone's patience as we put in slightly different settings than normal, with people's cameras off and just a bit of a pause getting in from the waiting room. As you may or may not have heard, we found that one of our events was disrupted early in the week, which unfortunately has been a bit of a pattern of people disrupting events outside of the YEF linked to race equity, which I find very, very dispiriting. But we put in place some new just protocols, which is why cameras are off and so on, just to try and make sure that we can always host really important content without people being able to disrupt it. In the very unlikely event that there is some sort of disruption, we would end the event, which would feel a little bit sudden, but we would end the event and then make sure we rearrange with even further controls in place. So just to explain why we've got those slight controls. That also means later we'll do some time for people to ask questions. So do, as we get to the end of Jade's brilliant talk, do raise your digital hands and we'll bring you in and take you off mute. So to the reason why people are here. As many of you may know, Jade Levell is a senior lecturer in social and public policy, particularly with a focus on criminology and gender-based violence at the University of Bristol. Her first book, which you can see on the screen, Boys' Childhood Abuse and Gang Involvement. I'm suddenly doubting whether that's your first book, Jade. You have to correct the order for me. Can I just say what an absolutely brilliant book it is? And I read it just in the last month or so. In my notes, it's pointed out that it's recommended by the Domestic Abuse Commissioner, Nicole Jacobs. I'm not at all surprised. I would also heartily recommend it. I think it's a fantastic piece of qualitative research of real life stories of people's experience of a really missed area, which is the way that domestic abuse affects our boys and can lead to greater involvement in street violence. Jade will talk much more broadly and much more knowledgeably about all of that. I spoke to Jade the other day and came away just absolutely looking forward to her speaking. So Jade, without further ado, people haven't come to hear me. I will stop talking and hand over to you. Do let us know when you'd like the next slide. Other than that, we're in your hands.
Thank you, and thank you so much for such a lovely introduction. It's really an honour for me to be invited to speak here today, and particularly because of the EF's report released this morning. So I think it's really brilliant that we're bringing this to the agenda. How I'm going to deal with the session today is to start by really taking a close-up look at some stories from boy survivors that have taken part in my research, and then we'll sort of slowly zoom out to think about the strategic implications of this. The reason I want to do it that way is because I think it can be really easy for us as professionals to become used to these issues as risk factors, right? Domestic violence is incredibly common, and I want us to really start with a sense of what could it look like, and particularly focusing on the concurrence. So what if children are being victims of violence at the same time that they're perpetrating violence? So next slide, please. Look, I've already gone ahead. You're going to see some pictures of my from Bristol that I've been taking as I've been going around and working on serious youth violence prevention with the council at the moment. So this first section, we're going to think about masculinity or boys' identity. And as some of you might know, I use music elicitation as a research tool often. So I've asked survivors, young men, pick 3 songs to help tell your life story. So I feel like it's always, I don't know, something's missing if I don't have at least one track in a presentation. And I think it helps us start to think about these issues in more depth. So if we have the next slide, and we'll just play a little bit of this song, so we can think about it. I think this one's very moving. If we just stop it there and go on to the next slide. This is what the young man who chose that song said. He said, "This song sums up my mum. I don't know if you've listened to the lyrics. This is my mum because my mum mothered and fathered me, do you know? My mum did everything she could for us. I think women are the most important thing in the world, to be honest, to have to go through all that pain and heartache and then get treated how they get treated. As a kid, I could hear as a kid the water splashing and all that because he had put her in the bath and then he'd beat her while she was in the bath. He was the nicest man ever when he hadn't had a drink. Once he had a drink, he would turn into a devil. He'd turn into a monster. So when I used to hear my mum scream and I couldn't do nothing for her, so I'd go out onto the estate and we started out as a group of friends. And then to cut a long story short, we went to all out war." I'm just going to go through a few of these passages because I want us to start thinking about the fact that this was going on at home at the same time that this young person was involved in life on road or in gangs. So if I can have the next slide. This is from a different young man that I spoke to. These are all obviously survivors of domestic violence who became involved in gangs and life on road. They said both, but talked about different elements. He said, "My mum's boyfriend was just bad, like alcoholic, drugs and abusive and that. I saw how he was with my mum. Stuff I saw at home has made me like I am now. It was like being terrorized. But then when I was older, because I was a victim for years, but now that's creating angry men, do you know what I mean? I don't know, it's hard to explain, but you know what I mean. It's like I went from being bullied and seeing all this mad stuff at home with my mum's boyfriend, not being able to defend my mum. And there was a lot of men walking around who were super angry and full of like rage and quick to snap on someone and punch someone because they felt for years they couldn't do anything. And that's what happened with me anyway. I can't speak on behalf of everyone, but for myself, it's like I got sick of being a victim." Can we go to the next slide? This is from a different young man. And I think you can start to pick up the kind of masculinity messages. That was what I was focusing on. How does it feel to be a boy who's living with male violence? and then having to deal with your own identity as a boy. So this young man said, for me, it was like, I want to be a man. I wasn't man enough because his dad was here having fights with women, making women get scared of him. For me, no way. For me, this was a big problem. So it became a thing. It was like I would go up there trying to pick a fight with men because it was a way to feel like a man. A lot of my friends, we'd grow up, parents would beat you to put you in your place. He's the man of the house. He can get away with that. So now when you go outside, there's no way, I think, there's no way you allowed anyone to disrespect you. It's like you can't do that because it's being done to you at home. You can't let another person. Can I have the next slide, please? This is the last one. We will start to sort of zoom out here, but I think this is important too, to sort of demonstrate that though I was doing sort of in-depth research with obviously quite a niche group of young men, this is also from a child death review. So you can start to recognise the similar messages more and more. Liam had witnessed significant domestic abuse towards his mother at home. Liam had explained to a professional that he felt vulnerable and powerless to protect his mother and that he would never allow himself to be in that position again. A professional told the practitioner event they'd asked Liam why he felt he always needed to be the top dog, and he explained that it was because of what had happened to his mother. Next slide, please. So let's talk about this. Now, I could talk about masculinities and boy-child survivors for a whole session of its own, and that's not really the primary focus of today, but there's more in my book on this in more depth. But just to give you an idea of the typical story, and this is thinking about masculinities in particular. So there's a common background context of the men that I met, living in gang-affected area and experiencing intersectional marginalisation. So whether that's around class, race, poverty, these are vulnerable children. And it's important to say that because domestic violence is so common, it's certainly not the case that most child survivors end up engaging in violence. So there's more going on there. But these boys were experiencing this violent masculinity from a male at home, often their father or step parent. And then this was causing, as you can see in those narratives, this desire to be outside the house, this real powerlessness, this real sense of being a victim. I can't stop it. I can't protect my mum. There's nothing I can do about it. And where I would say it's important to consider a boy's perspective is that I don't think there's similar cultural pressure on girls to protect, to provide, right? To feel like a man in that context. So arguably the victim position, the way that we frame domestic violence makes it easier for women and girl children to identify in that way. And of these narratives, often then there would be violence in school. So these boys are going out, they're starting to be violent themselves. And for some of them realize that actually they have, they're easier to violence because they're used to it. They maybe are not as sensitive. Maybe they are able to feel tougher. Maybe they enjoy feeling tougher. And we can think about that in relation to those narratives, that if you're feeling victimized at home, weak, vulnerable, that actually that can be this kind of reclaiming of power outside. And then obviously, as I'm sure people on the call know, that these boys are then incredibly vulnerable to exploitation, school exclusion, and increasing involvement in gangs or groups or life on road, or there's lots of different ways that works. But that's how I've been thinking about the experience, particularly around boys. Next slide, please. So what I've sort of come to know, and this was from my experience, I used to work in domestic violence charities, and that's where I found out that this was an invisible group. I was working as domestic violence coordinator in Hammersmith, and I spoke to the gangs workers who said 90% of their caseload were living or had lived with domestic violence, but they were never being offered support. So we've got this interesting thing where boys can be really invisible in domestic violence services. but hyper-visible to youth offending services. Sometimes that children are overlooked because the perpetrator no longer lives at home, so they're seen as low risk, the risk is left. Sometimes they don't tell anyone, so no one knows. Sometimes because of this, these intersectional discrimination related to gender, race, age, poverty, we know that the research suggests particularly Black boys can be adultified, so they're seen as less vulnerable. And, boys who are engaging in youth violence, that's the whole message they're giving out, right? It's this real invulnerability. And the reality is that specialist services for children who've experienced domestic violence are increasingly sparse, underfunded, and there's been a turn towards high-risk brief interventions. So most children aren't being served, but we can talk about that later. And I put this image in to remind myself to say that I am fully aware that we're treading a difficult balance here this morning around empathy and accountability. I'm certainly not coming to talk about this to say that, young boys who perpetrate violence are less accountable for what they do. But I think if we want to think about prevention, we need to be thinking, okay, where's this coming from? And that's what I'll go on to next. So next slide, please. Now I'm going to talk a little bit of a step back, and we're going to think about some recent cases, high profile media cases, and how they can help us see that the artificial silos between the domestic violence and youth violence sectors, ways of thinking, actually don't necessarily make sense in practice. Again, this is another photo that I've been taking when I'm out and about. I think, there's so much simplistic thinking around this, that there's no knives, no body bags. Actually, we know in domestic violence that this is not about the weapons. And I think that's what we're trying to get to. Okay, next slide, please. So let's think about knife crime. Now, it's interesting that I've ended up talking about knife crime because it wasn't ever really the focus of my research specifically. But I think it's a really helpful lens because it's gained so much traction in the media, in policy thinking, that actually it can help us blow the lid off what is often considered quite separate. So we can think about knife crime as in the street-based serious youth violence, so this public space violence. Arguably, that's when we think about knife crime, we're thinking about what in the press, that's what we're imagining. But we also can think about knife crime as a weapon in a domestic violence case, right? That isn't necessarily used, that label isn't really used to think about when we think about knife crime and domestic violence. But the reality is lots of domestic violence actually occurs with knives. And the third one, which is obviously where my research has sat mostly, is that involvement in knife crime can be an increased risk for some marginalised boys who experience domestic violence in childhood. That's the one that we're often not thinking about at all. So next slide, please. Now, we'll start with the case of Holly Newton, and obviously this is quite relevant because I know John's been talking about this this morning. Holly, as I'm sure many of you will be aware, was killed by her ex-partner when she was 15. And you can see there the comment from her parents in the press, which say that, express this frustration that because she was technically under our understanding or our definition of domestic violence, it was considered as a knife crime rather than a domestic violence murder. In lots of ways, this is about categorization, but her case really highlighted the fact that when we think domestic violence, we're often not thinking about children this young. I think it's fair to say even the domestic part of the term domestic violence often still gives us this image of married couple, behind closed doors, woman with a black eye, you know, those kind of ideas that's been perpetuated in soap operas and stories, you know, for a long time, doesn't actually fit with the reality for lots of teenagers who are experiencing coercive control, abusive behavior. And because, you know, maybe their relationships aren't taken seriously by us as adults around the young people, that red flags are being missed. And I'm not going to go into today's report, but you know, I did see things like actually there's a lot of ideas around romance that young people have, which do verge on to kind of stalking and controlling behavior, which needs to be unpacked, but that's another story. So we have this case, which is domestic violence, but it's classed as knife crime because we have these siloed out thinking. Next slide, please. But we also have another aspect of this case, which is quite complex. And that is that Logan McPhail, who is the one who perpetrated the murder of Holly, he was 16 when he did it. And he also was somebody who lived with domestic violence growing up. So again, we can silo out this thinking of he's a perpetrator of domestic abuse. Yes, but he is also a victim of domestic abuse. And if you can have the next slide, you can see the judge's remarks. I'm just putting my heat on. So these are the judge's remarks. I accept that you had witnessed violence in your home. You'd been the subject of a child protection plan. Social services had become involved. There were obviously things you found distressing in your life, so much so that you spoke of ending it. On one occasion, you were found by a bridge. On another occasion, near a railway line. And on another occasion, you'd taken an overdose of tablets. You were exhibiting extreme stress and you were only a child. Violence to others, which you had witnessed, meant you had had to confront things which no child should have to. Now, obviously, I'm bringing this up and this is very sensitive, but I think we need, if we're thinking about this as a dual tragedy, you have children killing children, and we also have children who are experiencing extreme forms of violence at home. Let's go on to the next slide, because there was another case that I also wanted to talk about. But again, these are just recent ones that I happened to look into. So I think it's, you know, just interesting cases. So we've also had two boys who were 12 years old when they killed Sean Seashahai, he was 19, with a machete in a park. Now, we again have this question of what 12-year-old boys are committing such acts of violence, right? That's not normal, and it's seriously alarming. This fits into this the sort of circle on the screen. You know, this is more of a classic, perhaps, although extreme, and because of their age as well, more extreme. But it's still this knife crime, you know, it's street-based. But again, they also grew up with domestic violence. So if we could have the next slide. These are the sentencing remarks from this case. The first defendant is a child with extremely complex needs. He's experienced violence from within the home and from an early age. It's clear he's experienced change, loss, and unpredictability, which must have an ongoing impact on his sense of identity and belonging. And the second boy, the report explains in detail the second defendant's background and upbringing. The upheaval caused to his childhood by moves in the location of his family home, some of which was spent in a refuge, and the disruption that this caused to his childhood. The second defendant has a supportive and loving relationship with his parents and his brother. He was not known to social services or the police at the time of the offence. Interesting in a few ways, partly because, again, we're seeing child perpetrators of youth violence, of domestic violence, who are also traumatized children who have experienced violence from an adult male. So if you're thinking about accountability here, domestic violence perpetrators are often not accountable in these contexts. So this is something for us to include in our sphere here when we're thinking about these cases. But I also want us to think about that second passage. This child spent time in a refuge. Now, you only go to a refuge if you're risk assessed as serious harm, threat to life. Anyone who's worked in a refuge, which I did for a while, knows that for every one space, you've got a list of families. So the families that end up in a refuge are experiencing severe distress. But you can see then juxtaposed, he has a loving relationship with his parents. He was not known to social services or the police. I would argue that that really shows a lack of understanding around domestic violence. Actually, lots of families are never come to the attention of services because it's a private issue. The ones that come to the attention of services are the sharp end, and often experiencing other forms of marginalisation, which makes them come to attention of services more often, right? You know, they have more touch points with different agencies. But phoning the police when you're experiencing domestic violence is not at all the majority. So, next slide, please. So where are we going? How do we think about this? So we can see that the media's been picking up on this. Again, we've really got to think about the impact of the siloed thinking. So you can see the comment from Jess Phillips, things are getting progressively worse. Knife crime against women is classic domestic abuse, but that's not ever included in the knife crime strategy. And you can see the related newspaper article, knife crime against women and girls double. So how do we make sense of this as an ecosystem? I would argue that we need to think about all of this as gendered. Boys are perpetrating most of this violence, right? Men are perpetrating most domestic violence. But we tend to have a gender blind approach to youth violence. But we have, like you can see here, a very gendered focus on women and girls in relation to domestic violence. But actually, we can see that boys are just as likely to live at home with domestic violence, and they're sort of floating around in the blind spot. You can see here a quote from this paper, which I think is great research paper. In prioritising knife crime as a public problem over its manifestation as an ongoing private one, its gendered and spatialised features remained hidden. So, you know, from a feminist perspective, we could say that actually we're only worrying about knife crime because it's in the public space, and that domestic violence historically has always been second rate, hidden, private, not as important, doesn't make the headlines in the same way. But hopefully you can start to see by these cases I've mentioned this morning that that doesn't make any sense. What if actually the children, and particularly the boys who are growing up with male violence at home, are the ones who are then engaging in youth violence? What if that private-public divide makes no sense for children who are living with violence at home and perpetrating violence on the street at the same time? So the way that we compartmentalize these things just creates blind spots. Okay, next slide, please. So I'm gonna, I know my research is very qualitative. I'm interested in the stories and the narratives, how people think of themselves in their life. But I am aware that, numbers matter, and trying to make sense of the prevalence of this is important, because it is a niche. I'm not saying that all young people who engage in knife crime have experienced domestic violence at all. This is another one of my little graffiti photos. This type of messaging, when you start to really think about what it's like to live with violence, you can just start to see how these campaigning messages just don't make sense. Love life, don't carry a knife. For some of these children are terrified actually at home. Anyway, that's an aside. Right, next slide, please. So Experiencing domestic abuse is relatively common in the UK, and being offered specific support is relatively rare. So by the time they reach 18, almost 1/4 of children will have been exposed to domestic violence. The language we're using now is more about experience, because in the Domestic Abuse Act in 2021, children were recognised as victims in their own right. Before that, they'd always been seen as witnesses. So they were witnessing the harm against their mother. But this change in thinking gives us an opportunity to see that children are directly victimised when there's domestic violence happening. That has an opportunity to make a real big change, but that hasn't followed through in practice yet. I know the Domestic Abuse Commissioner's Office is releasing a report in the new year about children, so hopefully this will start momentum. But at the moment, their mapping found 29% of victims were able to access specialist support for their children. And at the moment, I'm reviewing case files on children who've died through stabbing with the National Child Mortality Database, and we're seeing this story, that actually the availability and access of specialist domestic violence support for children is just so rare. I looked into child death reports when I was writing my first book, and I found that 59% who had life on road or gangs also had domestic violence. The Children's Commissioner found children in gangs compared to other young offenders were 37% more likely to have experienced domestic violence. Croydon did a deep dive into their sort of gang involved cases, and they found 42%. You know, I would argue that the problem with the reason why this issue hasn't been taken as seriously before is because domestic violence is such a core part of a social work caseload. It's become mundane because it's everywhere. But I think what I really want us to think about is, what does it mean? What does it mean to live with violence at home and violence on road at the same time, right? Because we can become too used to it as a historic risk factor. Next slide, please. So we're getting some evidence around childhood domestic violence and more likelihood of knife carrying, and that prior experiences of violence are more likely to correlate with later knife carrying, rather than just a fear in general. So, you know, these children are, you know, makes sense why they'd be scared, right? If you're scared at home, the bar is already set at a certain point. You know, for some of these children, there is no safe space. Okay, next slide, please. What could we do? Next slide, please. So if we think about what this life path may look like for a particular niche group of boys, who may be those who are involved in street criminality, youth violence, knife crime, we have a real trend to place resources here right at the end. Often this is where we're getting the anti-knife crime sessions in schools, choose better, put the knife down. Obviously as well, when a child is excluded from school, they're starting to be involved with the police. That's where a lot of the money is going at the moment, with good reason. But it can be over-responsibilizing children for their own victimization. And I say that because obviously I've come from the domestic violence support sector, right? That's where, you know, my careers come from. And you just wouldn't give the same messages to victims of domestic violence as we do to young boys who are victims or at higher risk of being victims of youth violence. That whole, if you choose to carry a knife, you're putting yourself at risk language it's just, you know, it just wouldn't happen on the other side, which fascinates me, because there is something about how the sectors would treat girl victims differently to this, which is often dealt with in a kind of hypermasculine way, I would suggest. Next slide, please. So what if we start to focus on this point of childhood domestic violence? Instead of just thinking of it as something that is a risk factor, why don't we put resources there where children feel powerless, they want to be outside a home because it's not safe and they don't have anywhere to go? That's the point at which they start to become very vulnerable. And I would argue we could really think about masculinity aware, gender specific support. So tailoring support for boys with an understanding that they may feel failures because they can't protect their mother from this violent male adult. And also we need to think about supporting mums who are not only surviving domestic violence, but also a lot of them are then losing children to knife crime. So the impact on these mums, on these families, is enormous. And some mums really struggle to cope with sons who go down this path, as you can imagine. So if you've already survived your partner, but your son is then becoming violent and aggressive, that's a real challenging time. And at the moment, that's sitting within early perpetration services of domestic violence. But is that label that useful when we're looking at child victims? You know, sometimes it's so much easier for us to identify boys as early perpetrators. We're not giving them space to recognize that they have been victims of harm and they deserve space to be acknowledged in that way, rather than just potential risks for the future. Next slide, please. So something I've been wondering about is whether we need to think about this more broadly under the umbrella of majority male perpetrated violence. Now, every label, every term is obviously going to have its own problems, its own blind spots. But it seems to me that it doesn't make sense. We're talking about violence against women and girls. We're talking about gender-based violence. Arguably, gender is all throughout this. To me, this is all about masculinity. It's about gender. So what if we started to think differently about it? What if we started to really explicitly recognise that it is mostly boys who are engaging in knife crime on road? So actually, how would that help us think about the interventions that we're doing? You know, I'm still not sure whether, you know, sending a child survivor of domestic violence to boxing as a solution for their own violence is necessarily the best thing. But until we bring masculinity and childhood violence conversation into the room, we can't really explore that. So I just wonder, this is a wonder, but we can talk about this after. We need to think about how we stop siloing out different forms of violence and abuse and really recognise that these boys are victims and perpetrators concurrently. This is not about an ACE assessment. It's not a risk assessment. It is living and breathing at the same time. And even if the risk even if the actual partner, the violent male has gone, the aftermath of that violence will be going on for their entire childhood. I'm really curious, and this is something that I'm thinking about in my work, what we could do to facilitate knowledge exchange. I'm sure that domestic violence perpetrator services, domestic violence victim services for children, and youth offending services, gang services could really create something or share knowledge in an exciting way if we got everyone together. Because it seems to me domestic violence services don't necessarily want to reach out to these boys. And I could say it's kind of understandable, they're tricky. But equally, I think the youth, the street-based services could teach a lot to that about how do you engage with boys who are presenting in this way and vice versa. So that's kind of what I'm wondering. Next slide, please. This is my last one. I'm very pleased that we've got time for questions. More thoughts. I mean, you can imagine I've got lots of thoughts on this. I think we need to focus on responsibilizing adults. Now, this isn't just me saying it. This is obviously part of the child first approach. This is, you know, a much broader movement to be thinking about childhood. But I think especially, and I was thinking about this today, seeing the news and obviously how the F report, you know, relates to the Holly Newton case. It can be easy for us to go down this path of saying, okay, Domestic violence cases are getting younger and younger, and teenagers are impacted, yes. But if we go down the road of then wanting to label young boy children who are committing violence as perpetrators and put that in the same box as adults, we also could be over responsibilizing them. If children are living with violent adult males, that's the start of accountability, right? And then we need to think about this all in the context of childhood. You know, most children are not violent. It's not normal to be violent at 12, right? So I think it is about us keeping that in mind, that actually it's us as adults who are responsible. We can't just keep telling children, you are putting yourself at risk. Actually, we've failed if we haven't recognized that they're experiencing abuse at home and done nothing about it. I think it's risky to silo violence. I think it creates blind spots. Clearly, there are different qualities to violence. You know, it's important for us to think about coercive control and how that plays a role in domestic violence and the dynamics of domestic violence. That is clearly very different from youth violence. But what happens is if we create too much silos, we don't have the same professionals working across both. We don't have a knowledge share across both. And some children just fall through the middle here. I'm sure everyone knows that we have gaps in trauma recovery, mental health support for children. Most of these children who live with domestic violence are not offered anything adequate to recover from it. I think if we took a gender-specific view of youth violence and created gender-sensitive interventions, thinking about explicitly why it's a boy problem mostly. Not to say there aren't girls involved, and I would argue that that also needs a gender-specific approach. But we can't get into this idea of women and girls face gender-based violence and boys just bump around with knives. Well, to me, it's all about gender. And I think we could bring these strategic models closer together instead of it all sitting in separate partnerships, separate boards, and kind of blow the lid off it. Next slide, please, which is my last one to say the end. Thank you very much.
Jade, fantastic. Thank you so much for that. That was absolutely just so full of wisdom and thought. My brain is sort of still wrestling to get my head around it. Do stick your hand up, people, if you've got a question you'd like to ask. And you can see all the rounds of applause. And I'll try and bring people in. Let me do that rather than lead off with my own question. So let's go to John and then to Susanna. We'll just take a moment to unmute you, John, and so we'll do that, and then you'll be able to come in with your question pretty much immediately once we've got that sorted, I think. Let's just see if Yanina is able to do the magic. If not, John, if you want to just type your question in the chat.
I'm off now.
There we go. We've got you, John. Brilliant.
Hi. Thank you very much for that. That was an amazing presentation and really thought-provoking. I would like to just raise the one comment that you made about the potential unsuitability when you referred to boxing, but I'm sure you're implying all combat sports as whether they're suitable for children and young people in this situation. I'll explain who I am. So my name's John, and I'm the head of the Violence Reduction Unit up in Cleveland. In our first year, we did pilot a sports-based intervention using a boxing club. And I'll also add that I have a sort of an interest in. I'm heavily involved in boxing. My daughter of 15, she's an adopted daughter, a girl of colour. We live in sort of rural North Yorkshire, and she trains in probably the roughest boxing club in Middlesbrough and is a 3 times national champion, European champion. And my daughter has faced racial abuse quite often in our market town, but has faced only respect in a boxing club. And I get it, everything's a case-by-case basis, and certainly our initial intervention in pilot intervention we did in boxing club. I always think that violence can be raw. violence is an uncontrolled release of an emotion that is an anger. The one thing combat sport clubs do teach, and I see this on a daily basis, is control, respect, and appreciation of a rule-based application of force, i.e. when to use force and when not to use force. So
John,
now,
that's a brilliant question.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
I might bring in Susanna just to keep time going, but that's a brilliant one. Thank you. Susanna.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Susanna from the Lancashire Violence Reduction Network. So just on the back, I think it's exceptional, the stuff that you've been saying, and it really chimes with the work that we're trying to do in VRUs nationally. Can you hear me all right? Yeah. It's just my sort of observation would be this. I think this needs to be a cross-government conversation, because the issue of men and boys being perpetrators of violence and how you describe it, I might not be saying it in the right terms, but the fear that we're not allowing them to demonstrate that they have that fear, that they do feel unsafe at home, translates across all services. So I'm thinking particularly our people referral units and schools and behaviour policies, and we're not dealing with the root cause of the problem cross government. We're dealing with the siloed KPIs that each of our different agencies have. And I think the refreshing thing about VRUs has been, whether they get stay or not, the prevention partnerships have come in, we know. There's a real opportunity here to actually let out what the actual underlying problems are, whether they are not palatable or not, because as you said, I know I've heard Luke Billingham say numerous times, and Kia Owen Rogers, this is the context in which these children are growing up and fearful are we've done it, not them.
Super.
So I think
Susanna,
it's just a matter of focusing on that. Thank you.
Susanna, thank you. I'm sorry for cutting everyone off. Time is always never enough. Jade, a couple of interesting ones there. I don't know if you want to throw out a few thoughts, then I'll try and bring in others.
Yeah, sure. Firstly, to John, I'm absolutely not against boxing in a principle, and we've been working really closely with a club in Bristol that does amazing work with youth violence. I think what it is, when I'm going through case files, often I'm seeing they were referred to boxing and they didn't turn up, and they refused the intervention. And I guess all I'm trying to say is, if we had that question about the violence, about masculinity, it could give us, it's just an additional question, I guess. Certainly not anti that approach at all. And the second one, Susanna, yeah, I think you're right. Actually, we could blow the lid off this, thinking about fear more broadly, and go back to the root cause. It's never seems to be, the funded thing.
Fantastic, thanks, Jade. Then we've got Naomi and Ailing. Apologies if I've mispronounced your name, Ailing. Do tell me and correct me. If you can keep your questions slightly brief, that'd be fantastic.
Thank you. Naomi Clements. I'm from a social research company called Tonic, and we have a vast amount of interest in doing research in all sorts of areas, including this. I just wonder, Jade, in your experience, the overlap between domestic violence and serious youth violence almost seems obvious while you're saying it, in the sense, but actually a lot of people haven't thought about it in that way. So really interesting. I wondered, as part of your research, did you come across kind of that next step, or that kind of misuse of substances that might result from being exposed to violence within the home, then use of substances that's then driving violent behaviour as an additional factor? Did that come up in your research at all?
Fantastic. And then Ailing?
Aisling, sorry, it's fine. Hi, Jade. I love it when our work parallels. I work in a small local authority in London, and I have seen, we've done a very small study which has really just totally mirrored what you said. We're doing a lot of work around adolescent domestic abuse, and what we have found is the real link between our young men who are committing or perpetrating domestic abuse against their girlfriends under the age of 18, which is obviously a complicated issue in itself, and serious youth violence to extreme points recently. So we are about to embark on a big project with our youth justice services, with our youth work services, with our gangs team, using your work, Jade, of course. But I guess my question is there investment? Like we are trying to figure out how are we going to possibly fund a lot of this. We do a lot of it internally. And I think in terms of investment and financial support for projects like this, because I know obviously we're a local authority, we're kind of a bit luckier. We've got backing from internally, but there's a lot of services who could be doing some work, who could be funded to do more work. I know they do with the adolescents. So it's really about funding.
Fantastic. Jade.
That one's for you, John, I reckon, funding.
Yeah, maybe right. Well, I'll let you take a lead and I'll have Aileen come in more.
Okay, so the first question from Naomi about substances. Yeah, I think it gets a whole lot more complicated. Substance use as a self-medicating thing, drug dealing as trying to provide for families when, you know, they're being financially controlled, or you know, perpetrators left. I think that is common. And of course, then you're getting into the world of, you know, drug crime. So I think there certainly is a link. Whether I can say about that in terms of domestic violence specifically, I don't know. I think that it's certainly something that you could do more research on. I think all of these things, because proving cause and effect on any of it is more or less impossible. So it is just about stories. And I'm sure lots of your children in this position would have stories that overlap with drugs use and dealing. And the question about funding, I don't know. I think that we need to make this build the momentum. I think we're lucky from my perspective that this government has made these bold claims around halving everything. And I think we're waiting for the what does that look like? So I think there's opportunities, but no, I don't know. I don't have any more ideas really.
Thanks, Jade. We've got one more question, and that's Ahmed.
Oh, hi. I work for a small charity in West London. We are running an exclusions project that's been very successful. From my experience, I'm a mentor on that project, and also we designed the program and so on. From my experience, working with kids who are maybe years 5 and 6s has been much more effective, and it's much cheaper than working with, you know, 15s, 16s, you know, secondary school. I was wondering what we can do to help kids survive their domestic violence experience at that age. You know, it's a new angle for us, and it's something that we would like to incorporate in our program, and you know.
Ahmed, that's great. And Jade, if I throw in one other that got in the notes, was any thoughts on how we create or where we look for there to be safe spaces for boys? At school is obviously one, but they can't be in school all the time.
Okay, great questions. So Ahmed, in terms of supporting children around domestic violence, I think the first barrier is going to be about getting them to disclose in the first place, because often no one's realizing until it's happened quite a long time ago. That's a very thorny issue because a lot of families are afraid of social services involvement at that moment. And, you know, lots of the cases I've been looking at, you know, the families, the parents don't give permission for the children to have support around this issue. So I think that's something for us all to think about. How do we get children, using the fact that they are now direct victims, they're recognised as direct victims, how do we almost make it their right to have support around domestic violence instead of it being how it currently is? You've reminded me, though, of one thing I did want to say today about interventions in schools, because I know that it was part of the announcements this morning around healthy relationships in schools. The biggest thing I think with school intervention, whether it's around knife crime, whether it's around healthy relationships, is that we've always got to remember that there will almost certainly be children living with domestic violence in that room. So that needs to inform the whole way we talk about this. Because if we go in and say, boys need to respect women, you need to be doing better on this, or put down knives and stop, you know, we've got to think, what if you're living with domestic violence at that exact moment? And I don't think we've got that right yet. You know, how do we talk about this without silencing further children who will then feel immense shame about what they're living with? So that's that. And the second question was about safe spaces. Well, yeah, we all know that, you know, youth clubs and youth spaces have been underfunded, and there may be, you know, this new direction for youth hubs. I guess the one thing I think about when I think about sports clubs and boxing clubs, it's not because I don't think they don't do brilliant work. I know they do. But it's that we can somehow, because it can be kind of a masculinized response to youth violence, that kind of tough response. There is a kind of culture that's different in the sector from domestic violence, for instance. We can almost just forget that boys might not want to be tough all the time. You know, libraries, for instance, have always been a sanctuary for people. And I think actually, if we break our ideas or open our ideas about different types of ways of being a child, and what you might want is actually calm and quiet and safe. And so broadening out what a safe space can look like, so that it's not always assumed that children just want to go and, you know, do things which stereotypically are associated with youth culture. So, but yeah, I don't know. It's always about funding. I know these are all ideas. You need to tell me what comes next.
Fantastic, Jade. We're remarkably coming to the end of time. Can I say a colossal thank you on everyone's behalf? And I'm sure people would want to join me in just saying, you know, huge thanks, whether digitally or silently in their mute faces. But that was a tour de force. You know, it's just made us all think about, look, hang on, we can't separate these different silos. And also, what does it mean we do, therefore? And so I'm going to be concentrating on lots of this for a long time. But Jade, thank you for giving up your time. And thank you to everyone for joining. I put a link to Jade's book in the chat. I hugely recommend it. And do come and join any of these cafes in future if this is the sort of stuff you're keen to hear about. But Jade, thank you very much. We'll let you go, and I'll let everyone else go. And wishing everyone the best. Bye for now.
Thank you so much.